Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here. Tell me, when did you last trust an old page at face value, ink, seal and all? Some records, Watson learned, are written twice. Once by a careful hand, once by a guilty one beneath it. Do subscribe, that no forged line escapes your notice. Now draw near the lamp, for as Holmes held, it is the small, false detail, not the large one, that betrays the whole. Find us too on Spotify, Watson's Margins, linked below. Chapter 1. The Summons from Witchcombe. It was, I believe, during the third week of January in one of the bitterest winters that London had known in many years, that there came to our rooms in Baker Street a visitor whose errand was to draw Sherlock Holmes and myself into as singular and melancholy an affair as any I have set down in these memoirs. The snow had lain unbroken upon the pavements for the better part of a week, and the fog which so often softens our winters had given way instead to a hard, bright cold that made the very gas lamp seem to burn with a keener flame. I had come down that morning to find Holmes already at the breakfast table, though he had touched nothing upon his plate, being absorbed instead in a monograph upon the variations of ecclesiastical handwriting across 3 centuries, a subject which he pursued, as he pursued so many others, not from idle curiosity but from some presentiment, half conscious even to himself that the knowledge would one day prove of use. "You will observe, Watson," said he, without lifting his eyes from the page, "that a man's hand alters less with age than is commonly supposed, but alters considerably with haste, with illness, and with fear. It is one of the small tragedies of the forger's trade that he can copy the letters of another man perfectly, and yet betray himself by the very steadiness of his copying." I had long since ceased to marvel at the manner in which Holmes's private studies anticipated the business that fate had in store for him, and I made some idle reply before turning to the newspaper. We had not long to wait, however, before Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor, a clergyman, she said, who had come up from the country and seemed in a condition of great distress. The gentleman who was shown into our sitting-room was perhaps 60 years of age, tall and spare, with the stooped shoulders of a scholar and a face that had been weathered by open country rather than by town living. He wore the plain black of a rural incumbent, somewhat travel-stained, and his hands, as he drew a leather document case from beneath his coat, trembled with a mixture of cold and agitation. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I am the Reverend Amos Calder, rector of St. Ethelred's, in the parish of Witchcombe, in Northumberland. I have travelled the better part of 2 days to consult you upon a matter which I believe may involve nothing less than a deliberate and cunning fraud, practised, I fear, upon a family to whom I owe every duty of pastoral care." Holmes waved him to the basket chair beside the fire, and regarded him for a moment with that quick, comprehensive glance which seemed to take in the whole history of a man before he had spoken a dozen words. "You have come by the night train from the north," said he, "and you have not slept, unless I am mistaken, since the matter first presented itself to you. You are unmarried, you have kept your present living for a good many years, and you have recently been engaged in close work with old documents, by lamplight, and against your own inclination, for you are a man more accustomed to open air and country visiting than to the examination of registers." Mr. Calder started. "All of that is true, sir, though I cannot conceive how you have arrived at it. The mud upon your boots is of a particular red clay found only in the northern counties, and it is dry, which tells me you did not walk far this morning, having come directly from the railway station. Your collar, though clerical, is of a cut some 15 years out of fashion, which speaks of a settled bachelor establishment rather than a household with a wife's attention to such things. And your right forefinger bears the unmistakable ink stain of a man who has spent long hours with a quill or steel nib upon old paper, a stain fresher than the rest of your dress, which is otherwise that of a countryman unused to town. But you did not come here, Mr. Calder, to have your boots read. Pray tell us what has brought you." The rector opened his document case and produced a single sheet, a certified copy, as he explained, of an entry in his parish burial register. "This," said he, laying it upon the table, "records the death 24 years ago of one Edmund Marwood, an infant, the grandson of Sir Julian Marwood of Witchcombe Hall, which stands, as it happens, immediately beside my own church. The matter is of no small importance, Mr. Holmes, for Sir Julian's elder son Arthur married many years since beneath his station, against his father's wishes, and disappeared abroad in consequence, and has not since been heard from with any certainty. If the child Edmund died, as this entry declares in his infancy, then the estate of Witchcombe must pass upon Sir Julian's death to his nephew, Mr. Geoffrey Marwood. But if the boy lived, Mr. Geoffrey has no claim whatever. And you doubt the entry?" "I have come to doubt it profoundly, sir, though I would give a great deal to be wrong. I have had occasion, in preparing certain parish records for a diocesan visitation, to examine the original register with some care, and I confess that certain particulars troubled me. The ink of this entry is markedly darker than that of the entries immediately before and after it, though all were supposedly written within the same 12-month. The hand imitates that of my predecessor, old Mr. Ashworth, closely enough to deceive a casual eye, and yet it lacks, if I may so express it, the natural rhythm of his pen, the small inequalities that come of long habit. And most curious of all, Mr. Holmes, the burial is nowhere mentioned in the sexton's account book, though every other interment of that year, however humble, is there set down with its fee." Holmes had taken up the certified copy and was studying it beneath his lens with the close, silent attention that I had learned to recognise as the surest sign of his interest being thoroughly engaged. "You did well to notice these things, Mr. Calder. The apparent age of a document, I may tell you, is very often less important than the reason why someone wishes it to be believed. A forgery need not be detected by its errors. It is far oftener betrayed by the very anxiety of its author to appear correct." He set down the paper. "You spoke of examining the register further. Have you done so?" "I had intended to make a full comparison this very week, sir, with certain family papers preserved at the Hall, for Sir Julian has generously offered every assistance. But before I could complete my arrangements, he broke off, and at that moment there came a sharp rap upon our door, and Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram, which she said had been redirected from the rector's hotel by his own instruction, in case of urgent word from the north. Calder tore it open with unsteady fingers, read it, and passed it to Holmes without a word. I read it over my friend's shoulder. It was from Witchcombe Hall, and it announced, in the curt language of such messages, that the heavy snows of the past 2 days had blocked every road into the valley, that the telephone wire was believed to be down, and that the family, together with several others concerned in the settlement of the inheritance, were already gathered at the Hall and must now remain there until the thaw. "It would seem, Mr. Calder," said Holmes slowly, "that the matter has acquired a certain urgency of its own devising. A household isolated by snow, an inheritance in dispute, and a document whose authenticity has just been called seriously into question. These are ingredients, I think, that will not wait upon the convenience of the diocesan visitation." He rose and reached for his pipe. "Watson, I fancy we shall want our thickest coats. Mr. Calder, if you can be ready to take the afternoon train, I believe Dr. Watson and I will accompany you into Northumberland." The rector's relief was evident in every line of his weathered face, though it was tempered, I thought, by an anxiety that no reassurance of ours could wholly dispel. For my own part, as I went to make ready for our journey, I confess that I felt the familiar quickening of interest that always attended the opening of one of Holmes's cases, though I little imagined, as I packed my bag against the northern cold, how dark and strange a business awaited us beyond the snow. Chapter 2. The House Beyond the Snow. The journey north remains in my memory as a succession of grey and white images, broken country giving way to whiter country still, until at last, in the failing light of a short winter afternoon, our train set us down at a small station whose platform had been shovelled clear only within the hour, and even then imperfectly. A trap had been sent for the Reverend Calder, and Sir Julian's own coachman, a taciturn man wrapped to the eyes in mufflers, informed us that we had come only just in time, for the drifts upon the upper road were already level with the hedgerows, and another day's snow, he thought, would close it altogether. We drove for the better part of an hour through a landscape scoured white and silent, the horses labouring, until at length we came upon Witchcombe Hall, a long grey manor of considerable age, standing upon rising ground with its gables outlined sharply against a darkening sky. Immediately adjoining it, connected by a covered stone cloister, whose arches I could dimly make out even in that failing light, stood the small church of St. Ethelred's, squat and ancient, with a square tower that seemed to hunch itself against the weather. Holmes regarded this arrangement of house and church with particular attention as we descended from the trap. "You will observe, Watson," said he in a low voice, "that a man might pass from the hall to the vestry, or from the vestry to the hall, without setting foot upon open ground at all. That is a circumstance worth remembering in a house so thoroughly cut off from the world." We were received in the great hall of the manor by Sir Julian Marwood himself, an old gentleman of upright bearing whose courtesy, though grave, was entirely sincere, and who expressed in a few well-chosen words his gratitude that Mr. Holmes should have troubled himself to come so far in such weather upon a matter of family concern. He was a man, I judged, well past 70, yet possessed still of a certain erect dignity that spoke of a lifetime's habit of command, though I fancied I detected beneath his composure the strain of a man who had waited 24 years for a question to be settled, and feared now that it might be settled wrongly. The household that had gathered, whether by design or by the mere accident of the storm to see the matter through, was presented to us in the course of that first evening. Mr. Geoffrey Marwood, the nephew whose inheritance hung upon the register's authenticity, proved a modest, fair-haired young man of perhaps 30, whose manner struck me as wholly without the calculation one might have looked for in a man with so much at stake. "Indeed?" he said as much himself, quite early in our acquaintance. "I give you my word, Mr. Holmes," said he, "that if my cousin Edmund can be shown to be living, I shall surrender every claim upon this house without a murmur. I have never coveted what was not honestly mine." His mother, Lady Beatrice, sat near him throughout this speech with an expression I found difficult to read, a mixture, I thought, of pride in her son and a watchfulness that seemed to extend beyond him to every person in the room. She was a handsome woman still, though her features had hardened perhaps under long habit of guarding her family's interests, and she declared, with some warmth, that no Marwood would knowingly profit by fraud, a sentiment to which Sir Julian assented gravely, though I could not but notice that Geoffrey himself said nothing further upon the point. There was also present Miss Clara Wynne, Sir Julian's secretary, a young woman of quiet competence who moved about the business of the household with an efficiency that spoke of long practice, though I observed that her eyes, when Geoffrey spoke, went anywhere but to his face. Dr. Nathaniel Gray, the family physician, a stout, comfortable man of middle age, greeted us with professional geniality, and old Elias Fenn, the churchwarden, a bent, white-haired figure who had served the parish, he told us, for over 40 years, hovered near the fire with an air of a man not entirely at his ease. Mr. Peregrine Holt, the family solicitor, completed the party, a smooth, well-spoken gentleman of perhaps 45, who at once placed himself and every paper in his possession at Holmes's disposal. "You will find nothing concealed here, Mr. Holmes," said he, with a pleasant smile that did not entirely reach his eyes. "I have had the conduct of the Marwood affairs for a dozen years, and I welcome the fullest examination. Indeed, I have already prepared certain documents which I think will save you a great deal of tedious searching." I thought this offer generous, and said something to that effect to Holmes when we found ourselves alone for a moment before dinner, but he only shook his head. "A man who offers you the shortest road to a conclusion, Watson, is sometimes merely a helpful man, and sometimes a man anxious that you should not wander down the longer one. He said no more upon the subject, but I observed him, throughout that first evening, watching the members of the household with the quiet, unhurried attention of a naturalist, observing some unfamiliar species, and I could see that certain small things had not escaped him. Miss Wynne, I noticed myself, seemed unable to look at Geoffrey directly, though she coloured whenever he addressed her. Between Dr. Gray and Lady Beatrice there passed, when the arrangements for the evening were under discussion, a single glance that seemed to carry some private understanding. Old Fenn grew visibly uneasy whenever the parish accounts were mentioned, shifting in his chair and directing the talk elsewhere with a clumsiness that would have deceived no careful observer. Holt alone remained entirely composed throughout, answering every question with a readiness that I now understand Holmes found more suggestive than any hesitation could have been. It was arranged that evening after dinner that Mr. Calder should bring the original burial register across from the church, in order to compare the disputed entry at his leisure against certain family papers preserved in the muniment room of the hall. He seemed, I thought, relieved at the prospect of settling the matter definitely, one way or the other, and declared his intention of working alone in the old parish room adjoining the cloister, a small chamber, he explained, that had served his predecessors for the keeping of registers beyond living memory. Sir Julian offered him a servant to attend upon him, but the rector declined, saying that he worked best in silence and would not detain anyone from their rest. I remember that as we retired that night the snow was falling again beyond the leaded windows, thick and silent, sealing us more completely with every hour into that isolated house, and I remember too a certain restlessness in Holmes's manner as he bade me good night, as though some vague apprehension, not yet resolved into words, had already begun to stir within him. Chapter 3. Death Behind the Bolted Door. I had gone up to my room somewhat before 9, weary from the day's travel, and had scarcely settled to a book beside my fire, when a commotion below stairs brought me out upon the landing. I found Holmes already there, fully dressed, listening with his head inclined toward the stairwell in that attitude of complete stillness, which meant that every faculty he possessed was engaged at once. The circumstances, as we pieced them together in the confusion of that first quarter hour, were these. Miss Wynne, having occasion to carry a tray of tea to the parish room at 9:30, as had been her custom during Mr. Calder's earlier visits to the hall, found the door fastened against her, though she could see a line of candlelight beneath it. She knocked, received no answer, knocked again, and grew alarmed enough to summon Sir Julian, who came at once with Geoffrey and old Fenn, and who, after repeated calling had produced no response whatever, ordered the door forced. By the time Holmes and I reached the passage, the door stood open, and I shall not soon forget the scene within. The Reverend Amos Calder lay upon the floor beside the reading table, quite dead, his head inclined at an angle that told its own story to my professional eye before ever I knelt beside him. A heavy brass book weight, of the sort used to hold open the pages of a large volume, lay near his outflung hand, its corner darkly stained. The burial register itself lay open upon the table, and I saw at once, even in that first horrified glance, that a single leaf had been cut cleanly from among its pages. The window of the little chamber was shut fast and latched from within, and beyond it, in the light of a lamp that someone had by then brought to the sill, I could see the snow lying smooth and unbroken upon the sill and the ground beneath, without so much as the mark of a bird's foot upon its surface. "There is no other door," said Sir Julian in a voice that had gone suddenly old, "and no other window. This chamber has but the one means of entrance, as every soul in this house well knows." I made such examination as the circumstances permitted, and found that death, in my opinion, could not have occurred very long before the discovery, the body being still warm and the limbs not yet stiffened. Dr. Gray, who joined us within a few minutes, concurred in this general estimate, though I noticed even then a certain vagueness in the particulars of his judgment that struck me at the time as merely the natural caution of a careful physician. It was Inspector Larkin, a stolid, sandy-haired officer of the local constabulary who had been stormbound at the hall since the previous afternoon upon some unrelated business, who first gave voice to what several in that room were plainly already thinking. There's small mystery here, gentlemen, whatever the door and window may seem to say. 3 of you saw the parson himself cross the cloister not 20 minutes since, alive and about his business. Whoever did this thing was within these walls the whole while, and the leaf that's gone from yonder book tells you plainly enough why. This was confirmed, upon inquiry, by 3 witnesses whose accounts agreed, in their essentials, remarkably well. Geoffrey, smoking a cigarette in the passage that ran along the cloister, declared that he had heard, at very near 10 minutes past 9, the unmistakable tap of Mr. Calder's walking stick upon the stone flags, a sound he knew well from many a country visit. Lady Beatrice, in the drawing-room whose windows gave upon the same cloister, had glanced up at very nearly the same moment and seen, through the frosted glass, the passing shape of a man in a long dark scarf such as the rector habitually wore against the cold. And Mr. Holt, writing letters in the small study that opened directly upon the cloister's farther end, told us that he had distinctly heard the door of the parish room close, some minutes after the hour of 9, in a manner that suggested a man returning to his work after a brief absence. "It comes to this, then," said Inspector Larkin, with the satisfaction of a man to whom a difficult problem has resolved itself with unexpected ease. "No one could have entered that room from without, the snow being what it is, nor left it since, saving through a bolted door that none of you could open until it was broken, and yet 3 of you will swear the reverend gentleman was seen alive and walking not a quarter hour before he was found dead. It seems a plain case to me, gentlemen, of a man killed within these walls by someone who knew this house and this family a good deal better than any passing stranger could." His gaze, as he spoke, rested with a significance impossible to mistake upon young Geoffrey Marwood, whose inheritance, as all present were uncomfortably aware, had depended entirely upon the very entry now torn from the register. Geoffrey coloured deeply under this scrutiny, but said nothing, and Lady Beatrice drew closer to her son with the instinctive movement of a woman placing herself between him and some approaching danger. Holmes, throughout all this, had said scarcely a word. While Larkin questioned the household and Dr. Gray attended to the formal necessities surrounding the body, my friend moved quietly about the little chamber, and I, knowing his habits, kept the rest at bay as best I could while he worked. I saw him measure, with a small ivory rule he carried, the height to which the candle upon the table had burned, and note the figure in his pocket-book. I saw him cross to the window and examine by the light of his pocket lens the fastening and the frost that had gathered upon the inner pane. I saw him kneel, longer than seemed strictly necessary, beside the dead man's feet, studying the overshoes with an attention that puzzled me until I recalled how often, in our years together, the answer to some apparently insoluble question had lain. For Holmes, not in the great and obvious facts of a case, but in some small particular that every other man in the room had looked at without truly seeing. "You're very silent, Holmes," I ventured, when at last the room had been cleared of all but ourselves and the reluctant inspector. "I am considering, Watson," said he slowly, "not who might have wished the Reverend Calder dead, for that is a question any man might ask, but rather how a man may be seen to walk and speak by the tap of his stick and pass a lighted window some minutes after he has, in point of fact, already been lying dead upon this floor. Until that question is answered, I do not think we need trouble ourselves greatly with motives at all." Chapter 4. The Rector Who Walked After Death. Breakfast the next morning was a subdued affair, taken in relays as the household's nerves permitted, and I confess that I had little appetite myself, the events of the previous night lying heavily upon my mind. Holmes, however, ate with his usual indifference to circumstance, and afterward drew me aside into the small study that had been placed at his disposal, where he had already assembled, with characteristic thoroughness, a collection of small objects upon the table before him: the stub of the candle from the parish room, Calder's spectacles, one of his overshoes, and a length of cord he had cut, he told me, from a curtain in the passage outside. "I have been turning over the evidence of last night, Watson, and I find it a good deal more instructive than our friend Larkin supposes. He took up the candle stub and held it to the light. This candle, by my measurement last night, had burned for no more than 25 minutes when we entered the room. Yet Calder is known to have gone to his work shortly after 8, more than an hour before his body was discovered. Now a man does not customarily sit an hour in darkness before lighting his candle, particularly a man engaged upon close work with old documents by lamplight, as our reverend friend most certainly was. He might have lit a fresh candle partway through his labours, I suggested. He might, and I made inquiry upon the point. There was no stub of a spent candle anywhere in that room, nor any trace of one having been removed, saving a very faint ring of wax upon the table's edge, some inches from where the present candlestick now stands. I think it more probable, Watson, that the candle we found burning was not lit when Calder first entered the room at all. He set down the stub and took up the spectacles. You will recall, from our brief acquaintance with him in London, that Calder used his right hand for his stick but was in all else distinctly left-handed. He held his pen so, buttoned his coat so, and would, I think, upon consideration, keep his spectacles in his left breast pocket from long habit, as most left-handed men do. Yet these were found in his right. A small matter, surely, Holmes, and one easily explained by the confusion of the moment. Small matters, Watson, are the only ones I've ever found worth troubling over, the large ones generally taking excellent care of themselves. He smiled faintly. Consider also this overshoe. You will observe that the buckle is fastened in a manner that laces it somewhat loosely at the ankle, in a fashion I noticed and remarked upon to myself when we first met Calder in Baker Street, as being characteristic of a man who fastens his own boots hurriedly and without a glass. But this fastening is different, tighter, and buckled, if you examine it closely, in a manner more natural to a man doing up another's boot than his own. I confess these observations, taken singly, seem to me slender foundations upon which to build any theory whatever, and I said as much. They are slender, I grant you, taken singly, but let us turn to the witnesses who between them have given our friend Larkin his plain case. What precisely did any of them see? Holmes rose and began to pace the narrow room, a habit that always overtook him when a problem was resolving itself in his mind. Lady Beatrice saw a shape, through frosted glass, wearing a dark scarf such as Calder wore. She did not see his face. She could not through such glass upon such a night. Geoffrey heard a walking stick upon the stones, and inferred, from long familiarity with the sound, that it was Calder's own. But did he see the man who carried it? He didn't say so. He did not, because he did not. And Holt heard a door close, which is a fact susceptible of a dozen interpretations, none of which requires that the door was closed by the hand of a living clergyman, rather than that of whoever had already made him otherwise. There is one further matter, Watson, which I have kept until the last, because I think it the most significant of all. You will remember that old injury of Calder's, sustained, he told us upon the train, in a fall from a hayloft as a young curate, which caused him ever after to favour his left leg in walking, throwing his weight, as it were, upon the right at every second step. I had noticed the limp myself, now that you mention it. Geoffrey, describing the step he heard in the cloister, spoke of an uneven gait, but described it, upon my closer questioning this morning, as a dragging of the right foot rather than the left. It is a distinction the ordinary ear might easily blur in memory, but I do not think Geoffrey's memory is at fault. I think rather that the man who walked in that cloister last night limped upon the wrong side, because he was not Calder at all, but some other man wearing Calder's coat and scarf, and one of Calder's overshoes buckled hastily upon a foot not accustomed to it. I stared at him. But Holmes, the room was found bolted from within, and you yourself examined the fastening. I did, and it was that examination which chiefly occupied me last night while you were reassuring our anxious hosts. He crossed to the door of the study and pointed upward, where a small fanlight, much like the one in the Parish room, stood above the lintel. Every room of this house upon the ground floor I find is furnished with such a fanlight for ventilation, and every one, including that of the Parish room, may be opened by a hand from without, being secured only by a simple catch. A loop of cord passed through such an opening and about the bolt's own handle may draw a bolt home as neatly as any hand within the room, provided the operator has patience and a little skill. I found, upon the frame of the parish room door, a fresh mark such as a taut cord makes upon old wood, and a corresponding scuff upon the bolt's own handle, newly made and quite distinct from the accumulated wear of years. Before I could fully absorb the implications of this, there came a knock upon the study door and Inspector Larkin entered, his manner that of a man well satisfied with his own morning's work. "I think you'll find, Mr. Holmes, that your ingenious methods aren't wanted after all," said he, not unkindly. "Young Mr. Marwood had words with the parson after dinner, over some matter neither will name plainly, and a servant saw him near that very cloister not long before the hour in question. It's a plain case, sir, whatever cords and candles may say to the contrary." Holmes regarded him with an expression I had learned to recognise as dangerous in its very mildness. "It is, Inspector, a remarkably plain case," said he. "I have observed, in the course of a good many years, that the plainest cases are very often the most carefully constructed, and that a chain of coincidence which persuades ordinary men so readily is sometimes forged, link, by a hand a good deal less ordinary than their own." Chapter 5. What the Witnesses Saw. Holmes spent the greater part of that morning in a series of interviews conducted at his particular request, in the small study, one member of the household at a time, while Inspector Larkin, somewhat reluctantly, agreed to withhold his own inquiries until my friend had concluded his. I sat by, as was my custom, taking such notes as seemed useful, and observed that Holmes's method upon these occasions differed markedly from that of the ordinary investigator. He asked no man what he believed, nor what he supposed another might have intended. He asked only where a person had stood, what he had seen with his own eyes, what light had fallen upon what object, and at what precise moment. Whenever a witness ventured an explanation of motive or character, Holmes would cut him short with a raised hand and a murmured request to return to the matter of fact. Miss Wynne was the first to be examined, and I observed in her from the outset a nervousness that went beyond the natural distress of the household. Under Holmes's quiet but persistent questioning, she admitted, after some hesitation, that she had seen Mr. Geoffrey Marwood leave the drawing-room shortly before 9 o'clock the previous evening, a fact she had not previously volunteered. "You concealed this from Inspector Larkin," said Holmes, not unkindly. "I did not wish to draw suspicion upon him, Mr. Holmes, when I was certain in my own mind that he could have had no part in so terrible a thing." It was not long after this admission that Geoffrey himself, summoned in his turn, made a confession of his own, colouring deeply as he did so. He had gone, he told us, to the small conservatory that opened from the farther end of the drawing-room, to meet Miss Wynne, to whom he had for some months been secretly engaged, a circumstance he had concealed from his mother, knowing her opposition to any alliance she considered beneath the family's position, and fearing, moreover, that so delicate a matter, made public in the very midst of the inheritance dispute, would lend itself to construction of the basest kind. "I would have spoken sooner, Mr. Holmes, had I not feared exactly the suspicion that has now fallen upon me," said he, with evident sincerity. "I was with Clara from a few minutes before 9 until very nearly the half-hour in the conservatory, where any servant might have seen us had they passed that way. I heard the stick upon the cloister stones, as I have said, but I gave it no particular thought at the time, believing it, as I still believed until this morning, to be Mr. Calder about his ordinary business." Lady Beatrice, when her turn came, proved a more difficult subject, but Holmes's patience upon such occasions was inexhaustible, and at length she too made an admission that plainly cost her a great effort of pride. She had, she confessed, altered the hands of the great clock in the hall by some minutes on the previous evening, moving them forward in order that her son's absence from the drawing-room, which she had herself observed and rightly guessed the cause of, should appear, upon any subsequent inquiry, shorter than it had in fact been. "I did it for his protection, Mr. Holmes, believing, as any mother would, that a secret engagement, however innocent, was a lesser evil than the appearance of a prolonged and unexplained absence upon such a night. I did not know then what use such an alteration might be made to serve. Dr. Gray, questioned closely upon his estimate of the time of death, admitted with evident reluctance that he had known, from a word let fall by Lady Beatrice earlier that evening, something of Geoffrey's true whereabouts, and had, in consequence, framed his professional judgment with rather less precision than the case in fact permitted, in the hope of shielding the young man from an inference he believed unjust. I gave you my honest opinion so far as it went, Mr. Holmes, but I confess I did not press my examination to the last degree of exactness that I might otherwise have done. I am not proud of the omission, but I do not believe a physician's oath requires him to hasten the ruin of an innocent man. Holmes received this confession with a look I found difficult to interpret, half reproach and half something that might almost have been satisfaction, as though a piece long missing from some larger pattern had at last fallen into place. Your kindness, Doctor, has done Mr. Geoffrey Marwood no service whatever, however well intended, for it has served only to obscure the single fact that might have cleared him at once, namely the true hour of Mr. Calder's death. I would ask that in future you confine your evidence strictly to what your instruments and your training can establish, and leave questions of mercy to those better qualified to weigh them. The interview with old Fenn proved, in its way, the most painful of that morning's business, for the aged churchwarden, pressed at last beyond his powers of evasion, broke down entirely and confessed, with tears that I could not but pity, that he had for some 18 months past been quietly drawing small sums from the fund set aside for the restoration of the church roof, sums he had fully intended, he protested, to restore before any accounting was called for, and that his dread of Mr. Calder's examination of the old accounts, rather than any darker motive, had been the true cause of his agitation since our arrival. I never raised my hand against him, sir, whatever any man may say. I loved him as I never loved my own father, and I would have gone to him myself this very week and made a clean breast of the whole shameful business, had he been spared to hear it. Holmes questioned him closely upon his movements throughout the crucial half-hour, and satisfied himself, by reference to 2 servants who had seen the old man about the kitchen premises at the material time, that whatever his sins in the matter of the roof fund, they could not extend to the death of the rector, nor could they furnish any explanation of the forged entry itself. It remained only to examine Mr. Holt, and here I observed in Holmes a change of manner, subtle but unmistakable, a sharpening of attention that had not been present in quite the same degree during the earlier interviews. The solicitor answered every question with a fluency that left nothing to be desired, explained the intricacies of the inheritance law with the patience of a born instructor, produced, unasked, several specimens of the late Mr. Ashworth's handwriting for comparison, and even suggested with an air of painful reluctance 2 or 3 ways in which young Geoffrey might, in theory, have contrived to alter the register himself. When at last Holt had withdrawn, Holmes sat for some minutes in silence, tapping the arm of his chair with one long finger before he spoke. "You noticed nothing remarkable in that interview, Watson? He seemed to me the most helpful witness of the morning." "He was, and that is precisely what I found remarkable. Every other soul in this house has answered my questions, Watson, some readily, some reluctantly, but each in his own halting fashion, as honest people generally do when memory must be searched and painful matters touched upon. Mr. Holt alone answered questions before I had well finished asking them, and offered, unbidden, evidence that no one had yet thought to require of him. A man does not usually anticipate an inquiry so perfectly, Watson, unless he has had a very particular reason to rehearse his answers in advance." Chapter 6. The Missing Leaf. The afternoon found Holmes engaged in a close examination of the burial register itself, which Inspector Larkin, after some little persuasion, had consented to leave in our keeping for an hour before it must be formally sealed as evidence. We had carried it into the study, together with a powerful reading glass and a small folding lamp that Holmes had extracted, with characteristic foresight, from the depths of his travelling case, and I watched him bend over the great volume with the absorbed patience of a man to whom time, upon such occasions, ceased altogether to exist. "You will observe, Watson, the stitching of the binding at this point," said he, after some minutes, drawing my attention to the gutter of the page immediately preceding the gap where the disputed leaf had been. "The thread here is old, brittle, and darkened with age, precisely as one would expect of a book bound some 40 years since. But examine the stitching at the very margin, where a new leaf would have been inserted to replace the one removed." He passed me the glass, and I bent to look. Even to my untrained eye the difference was apparent. A thread somewhat whiter, somewhat less worn, drawn through holes that did not quite correspond to the older perforations beside them. "A clumsy piece of work, surely, for so cunning a scheme," I observed. "Clumsy only to a man who thinks to look for it, Watson, which is a very different matter from a man who has no reason to suspect deception at all. Consider further." He turned the pages with great care until he came to the leaf, immediately following the gap, and held it to the lamp so that the light shone through the paper at a low angle. "You will see here a line of small perforations, scarcely larger than pinpricks, running near the inner margin. These are the marks of the bookworm, Watson, an insect whose habits are as regular in their way as those of any man, boring in a fairly continuous line through the leaves of a book left undisturbed upon a shelf. Trace that line backward through the pages before the gap, and you will find it continues, leaf by leaf, in unbroken sequence. But upon the inserted leaf itself, there is no such mark at all, the paper being innocent of any worm's attention whatever. Which tells us the leaf now bound into the register was never part of the original book. Precisely so. Someone removed a genuine leaf containing, we must suppose, either no entry at all concerning the infant Edmund, or an entry stating some very different fact, and replaced it with one newly written and skilfully aged, in which the child's death was set down in terms calculated to satisfy the most careful scrutiny, saving only that final test which its author could not have foreseen. He had, in the course of this examination, discovered one further circumstance which he now showed me with evident satisfaction. Holding the leaf preceding the gap up to the strongest light the lamp afforded, he pointed out a faint impression upon its surface, the ghost, as it were, of writing pressed through from a page that had once lain upon it. A forger, Watson, does not commonly write out so delicate a fabrication at a single stroke of the pen, as a man familiar with his own hand might do. He traces first, in pencil or in a dry point, the shapes he intends to reproduce, correcting his errors before ever the ink is laid down, precisely as an artist sketches before he paints. You will make out, I think, even without my glass, the impression of two names pressed through from the page above, where the forger's pencil bore down with more than common pressure. I looked, and made out, though with some difficulty, the shadowy outlines of the words Edmund Marwood, and, a little below, Arthur Marwood. The entry, Watson, wasn't written spontaneously by a hand grown careless with long habit, or as old Ashworth certainly was. It was composed with the greatest deliberation, by someone who studied the dead rector's hand as a copyist studies a master, and who required more than one attempt to satisfy himself of the result. It was in the course of a subsequent search of the manor's own document room, a small chamber given over to the family's legal and estate papers, that Holmes made a discovery which he plainly regarded as significant, though he said little of it at the time. Among the ordinary materials of a country solicitor's occasional labours, he found several sheets of a heavy, cream-laid parchment, of a quality and texture closely resembling that of the register's inserted leaf, together with a quantity of fine tracing paper, a bottle of old-fashioned iron gall ink such as had gone out of common use a generation since, and half a dozen steel nibs of an antiquated pattern. These materials, Mr. Holmes, Holt explained when questioned upon the point, having come upon us in the midst of our search, are the ordinary tools of my profession, nothing more. A country solicitor is very often called upon to prepare copies of old deeds and conveyances in a style consistent with the originals, and I have kept such materials by me for years for that very purpose. You will find them, I dare say, in the chambers of every solicitor who deals with landed estates." Holmes thanked him with perfect courtesy, and pursued the matter no further in his presence, though I observed, when we were once more alone, that he had made a careful note of the quantity and arrangement of each item, as though he suspected that some, at least, had been disturbed more recently than their owner cared to admit. It was during this same period that I noticed Holmes's attention turning, in a manner that at first puzzled me exceedingly, to the various clocks about the house. He examined the great clock in the hall, questioned a housemaid closely as to the time it commonly kept in comparison with the church clock across the cloister, and made a particular point of borrowing, from among the dead rector's effects, the plain silver watch that Calder had carried in his waistcoat pocket. By comparing these three instruments, and by patient inquiry among the servants as to which timepiece each member of the household habitually consulted, he satisfied himself, as he told me that evening, that no two clocks in the establishment agreed within some 6 or 7 minutes of one another, and that the exact time sworn to by our various witnesses had each, without their own knowledge, been reckoned by a different standard. His final labour of that long day was directed toward the estate accounts, which Holt had furnished with every appearance of willingness, and among which Holmes discovered, after some hours of close study that tried even my patience to observe, a series of transfers extending over several years, disguised under headings of maintenance and repair, and payments to tenants whose existence, upon subsequent inquiry, proved difficult to establish with any certainty. He had scarcely completed this examination, and was on the point, I think, of communicating some part of his conclusions to me, when Inspector Larkin burst into the study without ceremony, his broad face flushed with the particular triumph of a man who believes himself, at last, to have outstripped the celebrated amateur at his own game. "You may lay by your ledgers and your candles, Mr. Holmes," said he. "I have found evidence enough to hang this case 10 times over, and it wants no clock nor wormhole to explain it. Chapter 7, The Heir's Confession. Inspector Larkin's discovery, when he laid it before us upon the study table, was calculated to shake a firmer conviction than my own. A search of the guest wing undertaken, he informed us, upon a hint dropped by one of the maids concerning a trunk that Mr. Geoffrey had that morning been at some pains to keep locked, had yielded, wrapped together in a woolen muffler at the very bottom of the trunk in question, the missing overshoe from Calder's own pair, a narrow-bladed knife of the sort used for trimming quills, and a torn fragment of parchment bearing, in a cramped and antique hand, part of a name that could be read, with very little effort, as the beginning of the word Edmund. "There, Mr. Holmes," said Larkin, not without a certain grim satisfaction, "is your cord and your candle stub answered plainly enough. A man does not hide another man's overshoe, and a piece of the very leaf that's gone missing from the register, unless he has some very particular reason for keeping them from honest eyes. Geoffrey was sent for, and I have seldom witnessed a scene more painful than that which followed. He stood before us, white to the lips, and when the trunk's contents were set out upon the table before him, he seemed for a long moment incapable of speech at all. Then, to the astonishment of every person in that room save Holmes, whose countenance betrayed nothing whatever of what was passing in his mind, the young man drew himself up and made a full and, as it appeared, wholly voluntary confession of murder. He had followed Mr. Calder into the parish room, he told us, shortly before 9 o'clock, meaning only to plead with him to delay his examination of the register until the family's own solicitors could be present, fearing, he said, that a hasty and ill-considered judgment might do irreparable harm to interests he had never ceased, in his heart, to hope might yet be resolved in Edmund's favour rather than his own. Calder, he said, had refused to be moved, and in the altercation that followed a struggle had arisen over the register itself, in the course of which he had struck the old clergyman, he knew not clearly with what, and had fled the room in horror at what he had done, taking with him, in his confusion, the cut leaf and one of the dead man's overshoes, which had somehow come loose in the struggle. I bolted the door behind me as best I could, meaning to make it appear that no one had entered at all," said he, in a voice that shook with what I took at the time for the anguish of confession. "I have carried the knowledge of what I did every hour since, and I will carry it, I suppose, to whatever end the law appoints for me. I ask only that my mother and Clara be spared whatever further pain lies in my power to spare them." The effect of this speech upon the household was profound. Lady Beatrice, who had borne herself throughout the inquiry with a composure I had greatly admired, gave way at last to an outburst of grief that Dr. Gray was obliged to attend to with his own remedies, while Miss Wynne, standing apart, declared with a passion that surprised even those who knew her best that Geoffrey was speaking falsely, that she had known him from a boy, and that he was as incapable of such violence as any man she had ever met. Holmes, throughout the whole scene, made no attempt whatever to defend the young man or to cast doubt upon his extraordinary confession. He listened to every word with an attention as close as any he had given to the physical evidence of the case, but he neither interrupted nor contradicted, and when at last Inspector Larkin, plainly gratified by so complete and unlooked-for a resolution of his difficulties, proposed to question the prisoner at greater length with a view to the formalities of arrest, Holmes offered no objection beyond a single quiet request. "I would ask only, Inspector, that no formal arrest be attempted until the roads have reopened, and Mr. Marwood may be conveyed to a proper place of custody, with all due observance of the law. There is small profit in haste, in a house so thoroughly cut off from the world as this one, and I think a night's reflection can do no harm to a case already so thoroughly resolved." Larkin, who had no particular wish to be burdened with a prisoner under such conditions, agreed readily enough, and the household dispersed at length to its several rooms in a state of subdued misery that I have rarely seen equalled. It was not until Holmes and I found ourselves alone once more in the study, the fire burned low, and the house settling into an uneasy silence about us, that I ventured to give voice to the perplexity that had been growing in me throughout that long and dreadful scene. "Surely, Holmes, whatever your earlier reasoning may have suggested, this confession puts the matter beyond further doubt. A man does not accuse himself of murder without cause. Does he not, Watson?" Holmes had taken up his pipe but had not lit it, holding it instead unregarded in his hand while he stared into the dying fire. "I have known men confess to crimes they did not commit, for reasons as various as the human heart itself, out of despair, out of a mistaken sense of honour, out of love. Geoffrey Marwood's confession has one weakness, and it is a weakness I have observed before in confessions offered too readily and too completely. It accounts for every circumstance we have discovered, the overshoe, the leaf, the bolted door, with a neatness that real crime, committed in haste and fear, very rarely achieves. Guilty men, in my experience, remember their crimes imperfectly, being distracted at the moment of commission by terror or by passion. Geoffrey's account has the finish of a story rehearsed, not the ragged edges of a thing truly lived through. I confess I found this reasoning, sound as it might be in the abstract, difficult to weigh against the plain evidence of the trunk and the young man's own unforced words. But Holmes had not yet told me all, and it was only some hours later, when the house was wrapped in the deep silence of the small hours, that I learned the final circumstance which had, I believe, done more than any other to prompt so extraordinary and self-sacrificing a confession. A servant, questioned quietly by Holmes before retiring, admitted that a note, unsigned, and evidently thrust beneath Geoffrey's door some time that afternoon, had been found and hastily burned by the young man in his own grate, its ashes still faintly visible when Holmes, with the servant's assistance, examined the fireplace of his room. Enough of the charred paper remained, held with great delicacy between two pieces of glass, to yield a few fragments of writing, sufficient, when pieced together with such other evidence as Holmes had by then gathered, to suggest that the note had implied, in terms calculated to alarm a man deeply in love, that Miss Wynne herself had entered the Parish room on the fatal evening and had caused Calder's death by some mischance for which she could never be forgiven by the law. He believed, I think, said Holmes gravely, that the evidence already planted against him would serve equally well to condemn her, once his own explanation failed to satisfy Inspector Larkin, and that his only means of shielding her was to draw every shadow of suspicion upon himself, swiftly and completely, before hers could be so much as suggested. It is a chivalrous error, Watson, and a very natural one. It is also, I'm now quite certain, precisely the error that its author intended him to make. Chapter 8. Confidence in an Error. The morning that followed brought no fresh snow, but a hard grey sky that promised more before the day was out, and with it a mood of settled gloom that had descended upon the household, now that Geoffrey's confession seemed, in the general estimation, to have closed the case beyond further argument. Inspector Larkin, I found, had spent a busy hour already in reconstructing the crime to his own satisfaction, fitting each fact we had gathered into the frame of Geoffrey's story, with the evident pleasure of a man completing a puzzle whose every piece falls readily into place. Even Sir Julian, though he said little, wore the look of a man reconciled to a grief he had not thought to face, and Lady Beatrice kept to her room, attended only by Dr. Gray. Holmes, however, had risen before any of us, and I found him in the study with the trunk's contents once more spread before him, together with several papers he had borrowed, on one pretext or another, from Mr. Holt's own writing table. "You're not satisfied, then?" said I, though the question was scarcely necessary. "I am very far from satisfied, Watson, and I think before this day is out I shall be able to show you why." He took up the narrow-bladed knife that had been found among Geoffrey's things, and turned it over thoughtfully in the light. "This blade is a small thing, Watson, meant for the trimming of pens, and I do not think it could have severed a leaf so cleanly from a bound volume as the one we examined yesterday. The edge of that missing leaf, where it was cut from the register, showed a single firm stroke, clean and unhesitating, of the kind made by a broad, well-honed blade, such as a solicitor's document shears, and not by the ragged, sawing action this little knife would necessarily have produced upon paper of that thickness." He set the knife down and took up in its place the fragment of parchment that bore the half-formed name. "And here, Watson, is a graver matter still. I have compared this fragment most carefully, under the glass, with the true leaf we examined yesterday, and I am now persuaded that it never formed any part of that register at all. The paper is of similar quality, I grant you, but it has been stained artificially, I think, with cold tea or a weak solution of tobacco, and creased by hand in a manner that mimics age without truly possessing it. A modern practice copy, Watson, made, I should judge, by the very person who first perfected the forged entry itself, and kept by him against just such a need as afterward arose. I confess that these details, persuasive as they were to a mind trained as Holmes's was, seemed to me still capable of some innocent explanation, and I said as much. Holmes smiled without much humour and continued, "There is more. You will recall Geoffrey's account of his escape from the Parish room, in which he described the bolt as already drawn when he fled, believing, in his confusion, that he had somehow secured it behind him without conscious thought. But consider, Watson, if the door was bolted from within at the moment of his flight, by what means did he pass through it at all? A man cannot leave a room by a door already fastened upon the inside, unless some other means of egress exists, and none has yet been suggested. His account, examined closely, contains within itself the very impossibility it was meant to explain away." He paused a moment, as though weighing how best to proceed, and then added a further point that struck me, when I turned it over in my mind, as perhaps the most damning of all. You will recall, too, a phrase Geoffrey used in his confession, that he had struggled to prevent Calder from, as he put it, extinguishing the lawful issue. It is a lawyer's phrase, Watson, precise and technical, and one I have not once heard fall from Geoffrey's lips in any of our previous conversations, in which his language has been that of an honest, plain-spoken young man with small taste for legal subtleties. I have, however, heard that very phrase, or one closely resembling it, upon at least 2 occasions from Mr. Holt himself, in the course of his explanations of the inheritance law. It was shortly after this conversation that Holmes made a discovery which, though small in itself, seemed to me, when he showed it to me, to settle the matter beyond any reasonable doubt. Examining once more the fanlight above the parish room door, with the aid of a small step-ladder borrowed from the gardener's store, he found caught upon a splinter of the frame a single strand of dark green silk, scarcely an inch in length, of a texture I should never have remarked upon myself, but which Holmes declared, after close comparison, to match precisely the cord used to bind certain bundles of legal documents he had found, the previous day, among Mr. Holt's own papers. A cord of just such material and colour, Watson, passed through this fanlight and looped about the bolt's handle within, would serve admirably to draw the bolt home from without, exactly as I surmised upon our first examination of the room, and I think, moreover, that I have found the means by which our disguised visitor made his retreat unseen. He led me as he spoke to the narrow servant's stair that opened from the farther end of the cloister passage, seldom used, he had learned, save by the between-maid in the performance of her duties, and pointed out upon the doorpost a small projecting nail, half hidden by a fold of curtain, upon which hung, caught and torn, a tiny fragment of dark woollen cloth. This, I think, will prove to match the tear I noticed yesterday in the shoulder of Calder's cloak, a tear which I confess puzzled me a good deal at the time, the fabric being sound and new throughout, saving only that single rent. Despite these discoveries, each of which seemed to me to point with growing certainty toward a single and unwelcome conclusion, Holmes said nothing whatever of them beyond our own 2 selves throughout that entire day. He allowed Inspector Larkin to proceed with his preparations undisturbed, permitted Mr. Holt to continue in that easy, helpful manner which I now understood to conceal so watchful a satisfaction, and even went so far toward evening as to remark within Holt's hearing that he considered the case, so far as its essential facts were concerned, very nearly at an end. It was only that night, after the household had retired, that I discovered the true purpose behind this uncharacteristic reticence. Holmes, drawing a folded sheet from his pocket, showed me a brief notice he had that afternoon dispatched by the one remaining channel of communication left open to us, a message carried by a farm boy on skis to the nearest telegraph office some miles distant, addressed to a London newspaper of his acquaintance, and worded, he told me, with the greatest care. I have announced, Watson, that a passenger newly arrived from Canada, one Edmund Marwood, has landed at Liverpool bearing documents sufficient to establish his identity beyond dispute. He folded the paper away again with a small grim smile. It is, I need hardly tell you, entirely untrue, but I have found in the course of a long career that a lie skilfully placed will very often draw the truth out of hiding a good deal faster than the truth, pursued directly, could ever hope to do. Chapter 9. The Walk Through the Cloister. The summons to the drawing-room came shortly before noon the following day, and I observed, as the household assembled in answer to it, that Holmes had chosen his hour with some care, for the light through the tall windows had by then grown strong and clear, the sky having broken at last into a pale, hard blue that promised the beginning of the thaw. Sir Julian took his accustomed chair by the fire, Lady Beatrice beside him with a hand upon Geoffrey's arm, as though even now she feared to let him from her sight. Miss Wynne stood a little apart, pale but composed. Dr. Gray and old Fenn occupied themselves with a show of unconcern that deceived no one. Inspector Larkin, plainly uncertain what to expect, took up a position near the door, and Mr. Holt, seated with his usual easy grace near the window, regarded Holmes with an expression of polite and untroubled interest. "I have asked you all to gather here," Holmes began, "because I believe the time has come to set before you the true history of the death of the Reverend Amos Calder, a history very different in its essentials from that which Mr. Geoffrey Marwood, out of motives as generous as they were mistaken, has offered to spare another from suspicion. Geoffrey started, and Lady Beatrice's grip upon his arm visibly tightened, but Holmes continued without pause, his eyes moving as he spoke from face to face about that quiet room, until at last they rested, and remained, upon the solicitor. For some years past, Mr. Peregrine Holt has had the management of the Marwood estate, and in that time he has systematically diverted, under headings of maintenance and repair and payments to tenants who exist, I think we shall find, only upon his own ledgers, sums of money that I am confident a proper audit will show to be very considerable indeed. So long as Sir Julian's nephew Geoffrey remained the acknowledged heir, a young man, by his own admission, of small experience in matters of business, and inclined by temperament to place unquestioning trust in his family's trusted adviser, Mr. Holt's position remained secure, but the appearance of a rival claimant, in the person of Arthur Marwood's surviving son, would bring with it new solicitors, unfamiliar with the old arrangements, and an examination of the accounts that Mr. Holt could not hope to survive. Holt's countenance had not changed by so much as a flicker, but I fancied I saw his hand, resting upon the arm of his chair, close a little more firmly upon the wood. Some months ago, therefore, Mr. Holt removed the genuine leaf from the parish register containing, we must suppose, no mention whatever of the infant Edmund's death, and replaced it with a forged entry, prepared with great care from specimens of the old rector Ashworth's hand, declaring the child to have died in infancy, and thereby closing, as he believed, the one door through which a rival claim might yet enter. Reverend Calder, examining the register in the ordinary course of his duties, detected the substitution through evidence the forger could not have foreseen, the discontinuity of the bookworm's track, the absence of any corresponding entry in the sexton's accounts, and a hand that imitated without truly reproducing his predecessor's natural habit of writing. "This is conjecture, Mr. Holmes," said Holt at last, his voice perfectly level, "and conjecture, I need hardly remind you, is not evidence. It is conjecture supported, Mr. Holt, at every point by fact, as I shall show you directly. On the night of Calder's death you went to him in the parish room under pretence of discussing the legal bearing of the register upon the family's affairs, a subject upon which your position gave you every right to be consulted. There, before 9 o'clock, you struck him down, using the brass weight that lay ready to your hand, removed the forged leaf, which could not be permitted to fall into the hands of any subsequent more skilful examination, and prepared to leave the room." "And the bolted door, Mr. Holmes? Perhaps you will oblige us with an explanation of that particular miracle." "Gladly. You drew the bolt into place from the corridor by means of a cord passed through the fanlight above the door, precisely as the fresh scoring upon both bolt and frame will attest, a cord of dark green silk matching that used to bind your own legal papers, a strand of which I found caught upon the fanlight's frame only yesterday. You then put on Calder's coat, his long scarf, and one of his overshoes, hurriedly, and, in your haste, upon the wrong foot, and at the very hour when the household believed him still living, you walked the length of the illuminated cloister, tapping his own stick upon the stones to complete the illusion." "A shape seen through frosted glass," said Holt, with the ghost of a smile, "hardly constitutes identification, Mr. Holmes." "It does not, and that is precisely the point I would have you all consider. No one saw Calder's face that night after 8:30. Lady Beatrice saw a scarf and a dark coat through glass too frosted for any feature to be distinguished. Geoffrey heard a step, and because the overshoe you wore was buckled upon the wrong foot, that step dragged upon the side opposite to Calder's own old injury, a discrepancy which Geoffrey noted without understanding its significance. You yourself, Mr. Holt, in your own study, made certain that a servant should hear the parish room door close some minutes after the hour, to complete the appearance of a man returned safely to his labours. I saw Sir Julian's face, throughout this recital, grow grey with a horror that no words of mine could adequately describe, but Holmes pressed on, relentless as the tide. Having completed this walk, you slipped away by the servant's stair rather than return openly through the house, and in your haste you tore your cloak upon a nail beside that stair, a nail which still holds a fragment of the very cloth Calder wore that night, for it was his cloak you had borrowed along with the rest. You returned to your study by another passage, relying as it happened upon Lady Beatrice's own innocent alteration of the hall clock to confuse still further any subsequent reckoning of the times involved. The candle you left burning in the parish room, considerably shorter than one lit at 8 o'clock could reasonably have been, was chosen deliberately to support a false hour of death, should any careful mind think to measure it, as in fact I did. And Geoffrey's confession, Mr. Holmes, this from Inspector Larkin, who had grown very still, was encouraged by an anonymous note, written, I have no doubt whatever, upon Mr. Holt's own stationery, suggesting to Geoffrey that Miss Wynne herself might be implicated by the very evidence Mr. Holt had already planted in his trunk, evidence including a modern parchment fragment artificially aged, and a knife too slight to have made the cut we found in the register, both of which Mr. Holt had every opportunity to place there, while the household searched the church for some sign of an intruder. Holt rose slowly from his chair, and for one moment I believed he meant to make a dash for the door, but Holmes, without any appearance of haste, drew from his breast pocket a single folded leaf of aged parchment. I have here, gentlemen, the true page removed from the register, found concealed within the false backing of Mr. Holt's own dispatch case, which I took the liberty of examining this morning while its owner was at breakfast. It bears no record whatever of Edmund Marwood's death, and I think, Mr. Holt, you will find it difficult to explain why, within an hour of my announcement in this morning's newspaper that a Canadian passenger bearing that very name had landed at Liverpool with proofs of his identity, you attempted to send an urgent message, by the one servant with access to the distant telegraph office, cancelling a payment to an agent you had long retained to watch the ports against just such a contingency. A man does not pay to have the ports watched, Mr. Holt, unless he knows very well that the person he fears may still, after all these years, be living. Chapter 10. The Thaw at Witchcombe. Mr. Peregrine Holt made no further attempt at denial once Holmes had laid the whole chain of evidence before him, and I confess that even Inspector Larkin, whose earlier confidence in Geoffrey's guilt had been so complete, showed no disposition now to doubt a case so thoroughly and patiently constructed. Holt was confined, under the inspector's own charge, to a locked room in the east wing of the hall, there to await such conveyance as the reopening of the roads would presently allow, and it fell to Holmes, in the 2 days that remained of our enforced sojourn at Witchcombe, to complete an examination of the solicitor's private papers that left no reasonable doubt whatever as to the extent of his crimes. The financial records, once properly untangled from the maze of false entries in which Holt had so carefully concealed them, told a plain and dismal story of theft pursued steadily across the better part of a decade, together with payments traced through a London bank, for old parchment procured from a dealer in antiquities, for specimens of the elder Ashworth's correspondence obtained under some pretext from a distant relative, and for the services of the port-watching agent whose telegram, intercepted in time by Holmes's own arrangement, had furnished the final proof of Holt's guilty knowledge that Arthur Marwood's son might still be living. Of that son himself further inquiry, set in motion as soon as the telegraph wires were restored, established what Holmes had from the first suspected, and what Holt's crime had been designed at all costs to prevent from coming to light. Arthur Marwood, it transpired, had died some years before in humble circumstances in the Canadian province of Ontario, but his son Edmund had survived and had been raised, under his mother's maiden name, in ignorance of the great inheritance that might one day be his. Sir Julian, upon receiving this intelligence, lost no time in setting on foot such inquiries and such legal arrangements as would be necessary to establish the young man's claim beyond any future question, and spoke to us before our departure with a warmth of feeling that did him great credit, of his eagerness to make what amends lay in his power for 24 years of unwitting estrangement from his elder son's family. For Geoffrey Marwood, the outcome of the affair brought a curious mingling of relief and quiet sorrow. He would no longer inherit Witchcombe, a prospect that some months before might have struck any ordinary young man as a grievous loss. But he confessed to me, upon the evening before our departure, as we walked together in the now melting snow of the garden, that he felt, in truth, more nearly happy than he had been since the whole troubled business began. I would far rather know myself an honest man with nothing, Dr. Watson, than a rich one holding what was never rightly mine, gained through a forgery and a murder I had no part in, but which my own inheritance so very nearly profited by. I begin to think a man sleeps easier under a small roof, honestly come by, than under a great one clouded by another's crime. Lady Beatrice, whose pride had suffered so severe a trial throughout the course of the investigation, had likewise undergone, I think, a change not less real for being quietly expressed. She sought out Miss Wynne upon the last morning of our stay, and I was given afterward, by Geoffrey himself, some account of a reconciliation between the two women that ended at length in Lady Beatrice's full and generous consent to their engagement, a consent given, she said, in recognition of the harm that secrecy and an excess of family pride had so nearly worked upon them both. Old Fenn, for his part, made full restitution of the sums he had taken from the roof fund, a sum which Sir Julian, learning the whole pitiable history of the old man's temptation and his genuine devotion to the parish, generously undertook to advance against the churchwarden's own small savings, that the restoration of St. Etheldred's roof might proceed without further delay or public scandal. Dr. Gray's conduct in the matter of his misleading testimony earned him, I observed, a rebuke from Holmes of unusual severity, delivered in private and, I have reason to believe, deeply felt by its recipient, though no charge of any kind followed from it, the physician's fault having sprung, after all, from misplaced loyalty rather than any darker motive. Of Reverend Calder I can write only with the sorrow due to a good man who died in the honest performance of his duty. He was buried, upon the 3rd day after our arrival, in the churchyard of St. Etheldred's, beneath a plain stone that Sir Julian caused to be inscribed with a simple tribute to his integrity, a tribute that I thought, standing bareheaded in the thin winter sunshine beside that small gathering of mourners, more truly earned than many a grander monument I have seen raised to lesser men. We left Witchcombe Hall upon the 4th morning, the roads having at last been cleared sufficiently for the mail coach to pass, and I remember the journey southward as a slow unwinding of white country, giving way, mile by mile, to the ordinary brown and green of a landscape emerging from its long confinement. Holmes said little throughout the greater part of that journey, but as our train drew nearer to London and the familiar smoke of the city began to smudge the horizon, he roused himself from his reverie and spoke in the reflective tone he reserved for the conclusion of a case, upon the lesson he had drawn from it. You will have observed, Watson, throughout this whole singular affair, how very little our various witnesses actually lied to us. Lady Beatrice truly saw a scarf and a dark coat through frosted glass. Geoffrey truly heard a step upon the cloister stones. Holt himself relied at every turn not upon the invention of falsehood, but upon the ordinary and very human habit by which the eye, having formed an expectation, reports to the mind not what it has strictly perceived, but the conclusion it has already, and often unconsciously, arrived at. None of them set out to deceive us. They had merely, each in turn, mistaken the sum of a few limited impressions, a shape, a sound, a garment glimpsed through glass, for the whole and certain fact of a man they had every reason to expect to see. It seems a fragile foundation, Holmes, upon which so terrible a crime should very nearly have succeeded. It is the foundation, Watson, upon which the greater part of human error rests, and I have long since ceased to marvel at its strength. Disciplined observation, if I may offer so modest a maxim, begins at the exact moment a man learns to separate what his eye has truly received from what his mind in its haste has silently supplied. Holt understood that distinction better than any rogue I have encountered in some years, and very nearly turned it to a murderer's advantage. I have set down this narrative, as I have set down so many others, under the title I believe best captures its essential character, The Mystery of the Forged Parish Burial Record, and I do so with the reflection, which has stayed with me longer than almost any other conclusion Holmes has pressed upon me in the course of our long association, that an entire inheritance, and very nearly an innocent man's liberty besides, had come to hang upon nothing more substantial in the end than the difference between truly seeing a rector cross a snowbound cloister and seeing only his coat.